moderating our Q&A session. If you want to raise your hand, Elizabeth.
Well, I'm sure you know Jacobson's work on the mid-20th century process of deracializing Jews, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, and the construction of ethnicity
Right.
as a category that enabled people to hang on to a cultural identity, and while debiologizing that, and therefore making that identity more unmistakably cultural.
Right, right.
Why not a similar move in reference to those African Americans
I think the issue at stake here is, in fact, looking at the expansive boundaries or the category of whiteness throughout that period in question. In other words, as Noel Ignatieff asks, how the Irish became white, and what was the processes of inclusion to do this. The other part of this, there's a sociologist named Mary Waters that does, in a book called Ethnic Options, looking at whites and white ethnics in San Jose and Philadelphia. And she makes an interesting thing too. She says that among her white respondents, they see their ethnicity as a form of kind of something they could partake of or not, you know? That it becomes an ethnic option, if you will. We can, as Irish, we can celebrate St. Patrick's Day or we could not. But do blacks or other groups of color have that same option? And
Well, I mean,
she would suggest, no, they don't.
Yeah.
So in other words, that doesn't become because of the way in which groups continue to be racialized and marginalized, the ethnic option for them is not there. But that said, certainly among the groups themselves, there is kind of an assertion of certain forms of culture-based identities as well. It's just that the kind of ways in which, that whiteness has just become, on a very diverse campus, oftentimes white students say to me, gee, I wonder if we have any culture, you know? This is kind of an absence of one. They think that culture actually is something which groups of color, individuals of color have, but they don't possess themselves.
One reason I used the word white, I used European American,
Okay.
African American,
and it seems to me that part of that process is eliminating
some of the aspects of white is not.
Yeah, it does, but this is going to be interesting, by the way, because I didn't put this up, but the census, it may have very different categories in 2020. And in fact, what it may do is have a category of white and then a box in which you can specify your whatever you want culturally. And that box will also be available under the category of black. So you can say you're, whatever, I'm Caribbean or I'm Ethiopian or whatever. But all I'm claiming is that there is ways in which people can sort of say what they want in terms of their own kinds of identities, but how they're being seen is quite another question. In fact, the census should ask two questions, shouldn't it? How do you identify yourself, and how do others identify you? And in fact, for a lot of individuals, there would be a gap or a difference in that, of the ways in which race continues to have a particular kind of salience with respect to stratification and difference in the United States.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks very much for your talk. I have
Sure.
a very vague, general kind of question. I wonder if you've talked mainly about policy and about legal aspects of race, and I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit on the relationship between those legal policy aspects and culture more broadly, and which is driving which. What makes me wonder is, in 1977, when these 5 categories are sort of enshrined by the federal government, it's coming out of a period where you've had the Black Power movement already making claims about a kind of unity of black experience, and that's followed by a white backlash against it, which in some ways is about celebrating ethnicity and in some ways is about race and racism. I guess I'm just wondering to what extent we can look outside of the things actually written down on paper in this way to go back to what I said at the beginning, I'm wondering to what extent culture drives these policies and to what extent the policies themselves influence culture primarily.
Well, it does, although, you know, you have to be sort of, there's a certain kind of specificity you have to add to culture with respect to those things. And I think there is a kind of dynamic engagement going on. I had a conversation with Jeffrey McCoon this morning, and one of the things I was talking about is how much of this research sort of, or these conversations happen in specific kinds of domains. So within the social sciences, it's talking a lot about structure, about systemic, the ways in which some of these things are embedded in cultural policies and practices. There's a whole group of other folks who are in like literary and cultural studies or performance studies who are looking at the kinds of meanings that get invested in race, the ways in which race is performed, enacted in some ways. And what I'm suggesting about that is that a lot of times those two conversations happen in two distinct silos, that there's very few opportunities for a very engaged conversation between those things. And I think what you're going to find is, of course, a tremendous amount of kind of reciprocal, iterative, just really practices between sort of institutions and culture, broadly construed, that in fact shape these meanings going forward. And that's kind of a big answer to a big question. Just yes, good to get in there.
I think I'm pretty loud, and I can wait on you.
I don't know about the back.
To push you a little bit on your conclusion, where
Okay.
you said something like, you know, we need these racial categories for some things, like if we want to understand if people have been discriminated against in housing or lending, but of course we don't want to like naturalize them or think they're something that they're not. It seems to me that part of your paper that makes sense for those examples, but it seems to me that the genetic testing part, I think maybe you want to go further, because it seems to me that some classification based on what I read in your paper is necessary because you might have medically relevant patterns
Sure,
in genetically,
absolutely.
reproductively isolated populations, but they map, those populations map very poorly onto these categories, right?
That's
so
the
it
point.
seemed like that section of your paper was really different. So
Yeah.
we're using too broad and too rough a category. We need, you know, these genetic test kits like 23andMe that you can get for $100 now are much more fine-grained
Yeah.
than any of these racial categories. And so you showed in the paper, I think, especially the hypertension example, not only are the racial categories probably the wrong categories, they can also lead to, and you emphasize they could lead to, you know, falsely biologizing race. They can also just lead to mistakes in diagnosis and treatment.
Absolutely.
So I wondered if you wanted to say we need some categories. Sometimes we need racial categories if what we're talking about is a racial issue where race is understood politically and historically, and sometimes racial categories are just a mistake. It's
Right.
just the wrong set of
Right.
categories.
Right.
So it seems to me that maybe those are really different phenomena.
They are, and thank you for making that clarification. I think that's right. So for example, in a lot of the ethnic ancestry tests or something like this, a lot of times they refer to particular kinds of locales and much more specific kinds of regions. They don't necessarily graft onto broader conceptions of what we mean by race. The same thing is true in the kind of Bidale stuff. As it was explained to me, is that what it was that the drug, Bidale, was supposed to work better on people who had, there's some people who, that the heart is not working. That's the cause of congestive heart failure. Others because it's another symptoms like diabetes that is causing congestive heart failure. And actually, it was found that if you really explore the sample, the drug works good on people who have diabetically induced congestive heart failure and not, you know, some other forms of cause. Now, that didn't map onto race, but people didn't catch that.
It might map on genetic difference.
It might map on. No, you don't want to suggest there is no human variation. What I'm suggesting too in the sciences, that the sciences are not immune to absorbing the broader discourse of these racial categories and applying it to their research. So in fact, which is a handicap among many scientists. They say I have to report this thing by the OMB categories to get my government funding, but these aren't the relevant categories for me to explore this particular gene expression or this particular kind of disease. But there's a kind of really seductive default in which race seems to be a convenient category for people to talk about and locate human variation. And it takes a lot to, as you say, think beyond that in some ways. Think there are reasonable things in which we could say, oh, this makes sense to categorize by race. This doesn't make sense to categorize by race, which means that in different instances we have to be either color conscious or color blind, depending on the situation. But that's a kind of much more nuanced appreciation of how we need to understand race and its kind of policy impacts.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to rephrase a bit the penultimate question about the relationship to culture and re-ask that as to whether you've developed any further your understanding of the link between the changing economic dynamics of American capitalism and the reproduction of these processes of racialization and racial formation, especially what we see in urban inequality and this education reform movements seem to be directly linked to the changing logics and interests of capital and new categorizations of cultural racism, other ways of talking about race, to recategorize people for economic
well,
reasons.
right. I mean, you know, one of the things that is covered in the paper, which I didn't talk about, was this notion about race occupying the role of a master category in American stratification and otherness from the very inception of in fact, the colonial project. That, in fact, our very notions of class, for example, who is free, who is unfree, the dispossession, for example, of indigenous peoples, are really contingent and hinge upon property rights, as Cheryl Harris talks about whiteness as property, et cetera. So it is explicitly linked to that. And many of the kinds of economic-based transformations, and here again, it's difficult to parse, this is the racial aspect of it, and this is the kind of class-based economic basis for this. There's a whole lot of, for example, of people who, as particularly the white population ages in certain areas, does not want to provide for public education spending, for example, which leads to a further impoverishment of some of the schools. I happen to think, even on a grand scale, the whole notion of neoliberalism, in many respects, is a racial project. You know, the ways in which we strip and cut out the public sector as no longer social supports or social network stuff, the notions that what we need are these kinds of rugged individual entrepreneurial folks, and the ways in which different groups are coded as being unfit to assume that kind of role. So in many respects, any sort of large-scale economic transformation, I would argue, has a tremendous racial project attached to it. And so it, you know, it doesn't get into some of the specifics, but what I'm trying to argue is that at different scales, many of those things are totally embedded in the kinds of capitalist economic transformations we're going through right now.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the implications of your analysis and your argument for that 1977 OMB directive. So I guess I'm wondering in particular, might we think that it's just a mistake to follow the bureaucratic imperative to have a single consistent set of categories that the federal government uses for all purposes? You know, I mean, the government does a huge number of different things, and one way of understanding your analysis is to say it's not just that sometimes racial categories are the right categories and sometimes we want to use other categories, but that race means different things in different contexts.
Yes.
It functions very differently in different places. And so depending on what it is that you, say the government, is trying to do, what you are trying to do, you might need to use very different classifications for race.
Right.
But the cost of that, obviously, then, is that you go directly against the OMB sort of thought that what we need is a set of categories that is uniform across all government action so that we can aggregate data or make comparisons. So I'm wondering whether, you know, the radical implication is that the government ought to continue using racial categories, but different racial categories depending upon what the government takes itself to be doing.
I would think that latter argument. In other words, that the state is going to utilize racial categories. What the content and definition of those may vary enormously, and it may vary enormously very differently. So, example, in California, I got passed in maybe 1980s, late 1980s. Filipinos are coded as a separate category from Asians for purposes of looking at educational achievement and police crime statistics. So that was a decision made by California to break out the data in a very different way. Now, what I'm and for example, in Hawaii, a lot of the kinds of OMB categories didn't make any sense. They needed a much more finer grain to talk about the kind of different kinds of ethnic categories that they were grappling with in the islands. What I'm saying is that we do need some form of racial record keeping. That's always going to be a policy call about what those things are. We might want to know, are blacks suffering from subprime mortgages? We might not want to know, are white Scandinavians subject to subprime home mortgages? That's a policy call, you know, and you have to think about these instances when you want to capture that. I hope I didn't want to convey this because when I first started doing some stuff on the census categories, I would be giving talks and people say, that's right, you just gave me a good rationale for why we got to get rid of all racial categories. You know, because I was critiquing the racial categories. But the point being is that in many ways, they serve very different things. Ward Connerly is right. Racial categories have been used to determine who could become a naturalized citizen, who could marry whom, all this stuff. But that was pre-civil rights. Post-civil rights, many of these racial categories were used for enforcement efforts to track and monitor persistent forms of discrimination and encode into policy ways to combat it. That's a very different use of what racial categories mean in two very different historical periods. So we got to be really attentive to that as well. Not only categories were used, but how are the categories being used by the state? Makes a big difference. Okay.
Good. Thank you for that rich talk. This is really a follow-up question on that. I've always been impressed by the discursive formation analysis, but it's sort of hard to see how once you concede that there's this really important function for racial and ethnic classifications in the social sciences, how you can continue to hold that racial classifications are so unstable. So what we want to know in the social sciences is how things are unfolding over time. Are whites less racist now than in the 1960s? Is police crime worse? Is segregation improving or growing worse? These are things that unfold over decades. So if you look at the literature on whether a pressure to act white affects African American educational achievement, that was introduced in the mid-'80s in California. In the early '80s, there was a study in North Carolina. Roland Fryer at Harvard then just did a nationwide study 4 years ago of high schools all over the country. These are contexts in which these classifications are picking out people that are distributed over large groups of time and space. And unless we take these racial classifications to pick out something stable, it doesn't have to necessarily be a biological thing, but unless we take these discursive formations to be stable things, stable discursive formations, it's hard to see how they can play the kind of role that you imagine for continued racial classification at the end. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit about how you think about that.
Sure. Let me say this, and you might not like the answer to this, but in many ways, what that speaks to the argument is that they can't be stable, fixed kinds of discursive formations. But the point is that, yes, does that hinder time series data for looking at stuff, looking at racial attitudes since the 1960s on as to who's white, who's black, you know, and so forth. But I guess what I'm asking of social sciences is to be at least attentive to that there are changing meanings being ascribed to these categories. And when we use it, we shouldn't come into it saying race is what race is and just simply correlate that. Black is black, what's the incarceration rate? What's the level of racial segregation? But in fact, that these categories themselves have had a very changing meaning. In the 19th century, different states had different definitions of who was black. And you could actually jump state boundaries and be declared a different race. You know, that makes stuff really difficult to trace in particular areas too. So I guess I'm saying you're right. You know, for time series data analysis, there has to be some continuity and consistency. My fear was that social scientists do that a lot without thinking very deeply about the changing meaning of those very categories, you know? So I want it, even if it's a footnote or a methodological note, people say, well, we realize that race has this kind of changing meaning and that there's different ways across the historical time span I'm questioning as to what this kinds of means. It's an acknowledgement of that. It's a kind of realization of that. And also, it's kind of realization that in thinking about that, in thinking about the reconstitution of some of these kinds of racial groups, it may sort of shape in some ways the analysis you're trying to put forth about consistency and difference over time. Make sense? Okay.
Thank you.
So,
Go for it.
so thanks a lot, and this is sort of a follow-up on a number of the questions, but I want to go back to sort of the strange political or intellectual bedfellows of the Racial Privacy Initiative. And I'm struggling with the problem of race as proxy, particularly, say, in relationship to pharmacogenomics, right? So in some ways, science hasn't caught up with what might be necessary in terms of diagnostic ability, right? So blood pressure is that's sort of a troubling example in the Bidil case because of just all the environmental factors in some ways, right, that we know affects blood pressure. But let's take African American women and breast cancer. So obviously there are lots of structural inequality factors that are shaping the higher death rates of African American women in breast cancer. At the same time, we also know that a more virulent form of cancer tends to affect them as a population, right?
Right.
So in an ideal world, if we lived in like Gattaca world, which isn't really ideal, but for the sake of argument, you could go into the doctor's office and they just run your, figure out what your genome looks like. Just like, this is the issue, So maybe that's not an ideal world, but that's what we are they're imagining or they hope for in pharmacogenomics, that you can actually name these things that are about your place of origin, but obviously can't easily be mapped onto race.
Right.
Because as you note, my mom did that DNA test, right? She swabbed it, and it's only like half your, it's like your maternal
line,
mitochondrial DNA, right? So it's a piece. So, and it's almost like they function as sort of a one-drop rule or, a sort of a percentage rule. Well, you look this way, so it must be what you are. But that's still where we are in terms of race as a proxy. And the other aspect of race as a proxy, which I think is something we're interested in terms of the modern segregation argument that we're thinking through here, is how do we think about class, right? Because one of the affirmative action arguments now is like, well, if you aim for class, you'll hit race because of historical inequalities and how they've been developed. So I think part of the challenges and the sort of complicated political bedfellows you can end up with is when it's appropriate to use race as a proxy and the arguments you can use strategically for doing that, and how that might be in violation of the traditional models we've used in relationship to civil rights projects, but that's where we are and what we must do. So I'm just wondering how you can sort of further elucidate on the race as proxy problem as something that I think we have to do in some context, and then what the dangers are of it.
I think the dangers are, and Prop 54 campaign illustrates both these things in some ways, is that different kinds of concepts of race are being strategically deployed. On the one hand, it's trying to use this appeal of race as an instrument of sort of domination historically, particularly during pre-civil rights movement. And then activists, civil rights activists, trying to use this notion about race and human variation, but particularly kind of a more biomedical kind of argument to assert sort of different claims. Yeah, I mean, it's to be conscious of the ways in which we're utilizing specific kinds of categories of race in some ways. The other thing which is very confusing, of course, is that this is not an either-or argument about race versus, sort of environment versus, genetics. In fact, as most geneticists know, the kinds of, it's complexly connected with one's environment, and different kinds of gene expressions occur. You can imagine indigenous people who live near toxic dump sites. That's certainly going to have an effect not only on your health, but probably your genes and what you bequeath to subsequent offspring as well. So it's kind of a complicated web here, what we're talking about. All I'm arguing for, I guess, in a much more modest way, is for us to be conscious of those decisions as we make them going forward, is to explicate what we mean by race as a form of human variation. And then knowing that sometimes you gotta push certain things in order to win certain campaigns. Certainly pushing the kind of more biological concept of race in the Prop 54 debate is what turned the tide. Because people saw it then not as an issue of, here's another initiative that's supposed to protect groups of color. This is a health issue that is supposed to protect all Californians. and to woo white voters into supporting that as well.
Thank you. I'm also interested in the question of how we study modern segregation, and I guess your decision in the 2015 version, republication, a new edition of Racial Formation
Which
in the
is
United
out
States.
now, but as of 2015. Yeah, I have no idea. I'm sorry.
So, but you decided to elevate, if that's the right word, race into a master category, as you refer to it in this edition, and that's an interesting move, and I'm curious about that. But I wonder if it's not just sort of pushing again a bit too far in the direction of a kind of overdetermination of race. And as I listened to the amazing analysis of census categories that you took us through with the sort of ways in which they don't fully engage social reality, I began to think that the zone of overdetermination, if I had to try and identify it, and this, I'm just asking this, I guess, as a comment and a question, is in the realm of mixing. In a way, the instability of race is all about mixing rather than separation and segregation, and these racial classifications, which seem so overdetermined in the sense is almost violent in their sort of denial of social reality, are only meaningful in kind of fairly tightly paired relationships with certain forms of mixing. Take the 1850 census, which had the first time of the tripartite categorization of white, black, mulatto. Of course, that was all about an engagement of a certain kind of violative mixing in the context of antebellum slave society. And there was a very sort of, mutually constitutive relationship between the classification and the social reality, which again was one of mixing. I wonder if you don't worry sometimes in your work as a sociologist and in the way in which you approach this, that that these categories do take on, in spite of all your best efforts, a kind of reality of their own, because you can't engage those kinds of shaping social realities that are also important in shaping the classifications.
I think that's right. In other words, yeah, they're going to resist that kind of position as well. And I think that's right about there's a problematic notion, the whole label multiracial or mixed race almost presumes there are discrete pure races of which one is multi-mixed variant of, which is just, an absurd idea as well. So there's real difficulties in sort of establishing that. I think what gets really, you're right. You can't just impose these categories in certain ways, but also they speak directly to how people experience them or how they address them in certain situations. So I'll give you an example. There's about, in the last census, there was about 4.7% of people in the US said they were mixed race, or checked more than one box. That's the one. Or no, that was less than that. It was but in California, it was like 4.7%, something close to 5%. So there's a political scientist on my campus, Taeku Lee, who was able to tack on some questions for a general political survey called the California Omnibus Survey, something. And he asked a very different race question. He asked first the race boxes you saw here, and out of his sample of phone call surveys, roughly about the same, 4.7, 5% of his sample said they were mixed race. But then he asked them a different question. He says, what if I give you 10 identity points, racial identity points that you could spread out and distribute? What happens then? And he gave the example of Tiger Woods. Said maybe Tiger Woods would say, he's this percentage black, he's this percentage Thai, he's this percentage white, or something like this. And when he gave his respondents that question, 24% come out as being multiracial. From, less than 5 to 24%, to nearly a quarter of the people. Because there were people who on the census say, if they're black and white, want to claim that they're simply black. Not that they're black and white, but you give them the identity points and say, maybe I'll park 7 of my points as black and 3 as white. And people started doing that. So in other words, who is multiracial is often contingent upon, too, how the question is asked and and the comfort level of respondents in thinking through different options and saying that. So yeah, to come back to your question, I think there is a kind of ways in which the categories can sort of, sort of overwhelm or sort of, be overdeterminate in establishing those stuff. But people do sort of, we need to probe sort of further and think about how people engage those categories. I mentioned this earlier. I think a provocative question is to ask how not only people identify, but how people identify them, and to see the kinds of ways in which that kind of slippage leads to real interesting things about how people navigate the system of racial meaning. We know this too, what that Latino, the 94, 97% picking other race is really a function also of new immigrant populations who come to this country and have to learn what the racial categories in this country look like. Because they certainly are different than the way racial categorization happens in Brazil or happens in other places in the world. But I also think that it's important that we saying that, I don't want to jettison the notion somehow that if we get rid of the categories, it would move us more closely towards a kind of colorblind politics as well. For example, France doesn't track by race. It doesn't ask people and citizens within its borders about race. And we certainly can't say that France has no racial problems.
Okay, let's have one more question right here.
Hi.
Hi.
The state's relationship to racial data collection has changed pretty dramatically.
Right.
The state no longer imposes a racial classification upon all children at birth. And so depending on the state, starting in the mid to late 60s and 70s, birth certificates no longer list race. So racial data collection has become much more about people on their own ascribing identity to themselves.
Right.
Right. That's very different than in the context of gender, where all birth certificates categorize people on the basis of gender. To get a driver's license, you have to identify as one gender or another, at least in almost every state. And so I was wondering how that different relationship of the state's role in data collection changes or problematizes your idea of race as the master template or as the master category that also explains other forms of oppression.
I don't know if that explains the form of, specifically in that instance, the particular form of the gendered expression of that. I will say that it does rely on a concept that there are, in fact, two genders, right? Male and female. And I believe it's Australia or someone, if somebody knows, correct me on this, where there are other options now. That, and in recognition of also one's transgendered status or how people want to be coded. All I'm suggesting here is that it's interesting. Maybe I said that as a master category too, that the debates about race open up conversations, movements and other things towards other axes of stratification and difference. And I think towards gender, it may be towards looking at, obviously, what's a vast literature too, the social construction of gender and the way the state recognizes that or not. I guess any sort of category is fraught with, it has a basis of kind of bias in social construction. I don't know if I mentioned this in the paper, but in global censuses, age is not a fixed variable. In societies in which the elderly are venerated and well respected, people overstate how old they are. In places like the United States, everybody says they're much younger than they are. So I guess what I'm suggesting about that is that in this specific instance, what it might open up, not so much that race directly deals with that, but it does at least offer one avenue for interrogating what we mean by gender. Gender as a continuum as opposed to a
and why the state is interested in imposing gender identity when it no longer imposes racial identity,
right.
At least from birth.
Right, right. Well, no, it no longer imposes it, but it still tracks it, right?
It's usually the parents get to determine what the
It's self-identity.
Right,
And that was
self-identity.
that's very late. It's like 1970 census. Before that, a census taker comes to your house and codes you unless there's ambiguity and then asks you. So yeah, we're at this point now where you're right. It is on the basis of self-identity, but I guess what I was arguing about that is that's an interesting kind of transition with respect to how the state is managing or assigning racially based identity, but it doesn't mean certainly that the state is not intimately involved in that. You know, on the birth certificate, doesn't that vary by state? Or,
no state collects racial information on birth certificates anymore. That stopped in the 70s and 80s.
Are you sure? Because
Yes.
I thought that's how we determine things like infant mortality rates.
That makes it, so I'm a professor at the law school, it actually makes it very hard for people to get certified as minority-owned contractors because our birth certificates no longer list race. And so proving what race you are has become very complicated for purposes, unless, if you're born after 1970, it's very hard to become certified as a minority-owned business owner because your birth certificate doesn't list your race anymore.
Yeah. Well, that's fraught with a lot of problems, you know, because as I heard once from a person who teaches at the Centers for Disease Control, we have a numerator-denominator problem there of people of births and deaths. And so I thought the data had to be involved because there's an underrepresentation of certain groups of people that, because death certificates oftentimes are filled out by the mortician and the funeral home director, who doesn't want to burden oftentimes the family with some of these details, and assigns race. And in so doing, we've got people being born one race and dying another. And that is an interesting problem for epidemiological research, apparently. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you.